Ooh, what's happening?
Rene, you're on.
Are we starting?
Yes.
Wait a minute. There's okay. I should go ahead now, right?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you, Rene.
Hello. Good evening. Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm reaching you from smoky San Francisco. Thank you very much for joining us today to talk about media persecution in the Philippines, democracy at the crossroads. We have with us two very important voices in Philippine journalism. Maria Ressa, the embattled executive editor of Rappler online news platform, and top broadcast journalist Karen Davila of the equally embattled ABS-CBN broadcasting network. Rappler and ABS-CBN have been the key targets of the Duterte administration's political and legal hostility. Our guests will share with us their thoughts on the state of the press freedom in the Philippines in the face of government persecution and prosecution, as well as the future of journalism amid the overpowering din of unruly social media. I will introduce them more fully as we begin the main part of this conversation. I am Rene Siria Cruz, U.S. Bureau Chief of Inquirer.net of the Philippine Daily Inquirer. First, a word about our hosts and sponsors. Our principal host is Akbayan North America, a network of activists in the United States and Canada, affiliated with the Akbayan Citizens Action political party in the Philippines. The Social Democratic Akbayan Party aims for clean, efficient, accountable, and participatory governance and advocates for a better deal for the poor and marginalized sectors of the Philippines. Its leading political figure is incumbent Senator Risa Ontiveros. Akbayan's International Secretary, Rafaela David, helped set up tonight's program. Thank you, Paeng. We are co-sponsored by Legacy of Equality, Leadership, and Organizing, LELO of Seattle, Vancouver Committee for Domestic Workers and Caregivers' Rights, Caregiver Education Support Organization, and TFC, the Filipino Channel. There are more than 230 persons who have registered for this forum, mostly from across the US and Canada, but also from the Philippines and other parts of the world, such as Australia. Recognizable among them are human rights and social justice activists, journalism students and academics, LGBTQ groups, trade unionists, health professionals, and Filipino press in North America. Some housekeeping instructions. This is a webinar format, so your camera and audio will be muted or are turned off. You can write questions for our speakers by using the Q&A button, most likely at the bottom of your screen. You can send questions anytime. Akbayan's Edwin Batombakal will be collating the questions, forward them to me to read to our speakers. And so we begin. A brief background on our subject matter tonight. The Duterte administration has persecuted Rappler ever since the online news organization in 2016 exposed his online army of trolls who were spreading fake news and threatening his critics. Rappler has also been reporting on the rising extrajudicial killings of suspected drug users and pushers done by the police with President Duterte's approval. Consequently, Rappler has been barred from presidential press events and faces at least 11 government investigations and court cases against Maria Ressa and her staff. These include charges of tax evasion and foreign ownership of her news organization. And Ressa has posted bail 7 times. She and a colleague, finally, on June 15, 2020, Ressa and former Rappler researcher and writer Reynaldo Santos Jr. were convicted of cyber libel for a story published in 2012, when the current cyber law under which they were prosecuted did not yet exist. Both Reza and Santos face up to 6 years in prison. They are out on bail pending an appeal. They are the first two journalists in the Philippines to be convicted of cyber libel. Meanwhile, amid the pandemic, congressional allies of President Duterte refused to renew the franchise of ABS-CBN network based on charges of foreign ownership, tax evasion, political bias, all of which the network credibly challenged. President Duterte then publicly boasted that by shutting down ABS-CBN, he had dismantled the oligarchy without having to declare martial law. The Supreme Court refused to hear ABS-CBN's petition to stop the original closure order, ruling that it is mooted. The closure of the Philippines' largest broadcasting network is leaving 11,000 employees jobless and millions of Filipinos with diminished access to information. Our speakers will further explain the plights of their news organizations and share with us what keeps them up at night regarding the immediate and long-term future of Philippine journalism, press freedom, and Philippine democracy. First speaker is Maria A. Reza. She's a Filipino-American journalist and author, best known for co-founding Rappler as its chief executive officer. Reza was among Time's Persons of the Year in 2018, a collection of journalists from around the world fighting fake news. She graduated cum laude from Princeton University and was a Fulbright Fellow at the University of the Philippines. Before founding Rappler in 2012, she worked for the Philippine government's PTB4. She was CNN bureau chief in Manila and Jakarta and headed the news division of ABS-CBN while also writing for CNN and the Wall Street Journal. She is the author of 2 books on the rise of terrorism. Joining her tonight is Karen Davila, one of the Philippines' top broadcast journalists and host of the highly regarded 10-year-old Head Start with Karen Davila, a morning news and talk show aired by ABS-CBN News Channel. Karen Davila is a mass communications graduate from the University of the Philippines and has hosted many ABS-CBN's TV and radio news programs, winning more than 20 journalism awards locally and internationally. These include the UNICEF Child Rights Award and the Outstanding Young Men Award of the Philippines. Karen was one of People Asia Magazine's People of the Year in 2013. She was recognized by the Philippine Senate as one of the outstanding women in the nation's service. We will start with Maria Reza. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is such a privilege and a delight for us. She will be followed by Karen Davila. You have 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will follow with a question and answer.
Great. Rene, thanks so much. Hopefully I won't take up most of it, but it is so good for you guys to spend time and for us to be here. Thank you. I'll just broadly outline, I think, 3 things. The first is you actually mentioned the buckets of the legal cases, and I think you noticed the similarities in some of them, although I will say we had more, right? So I think the first I'll talk about legal. The second, I'll talk about what's really changed in the information ecosystem and why media is under attack. These are very similar constraints that you're facing in the United States. I mean, frankly, if facts are debatable, I have no idea how election integrity can be assured. In fact, it can't. And then the third thing I think is, what can we do about this now? And I think this Zoom meeting is a first step. So the first is to I'll jump off the cyber libel conviction on June 15th. I was convicted. Ray Santos and I, a former colleague, were convicted on June 15th. Rappler was not. I think that's something that's quite underreported. So even then I wondered, how the heck, the organization is free, but is innocent, but the two are guilty. I was not involved in writing, editing, or supervising a story that was published before the law we allegedly violated was even in place. I think just that seems quite Kafkaesque. But I think the two big things here, and Karen has heard me say this, in order to actually get this case to court and to convict us, they needed to accept two premises. The judge, this is Judge Reynaldo Estacio Montesa. She had to say that it is the statute of limitations, or the period of prescription for libel, which is 1 year, was changed to 12 years. That was in the verdict. And then when we filed a motion for partial reconsideration, so in order to make it 12 years, she cited a law that was nearly a century old, superseded now. That was our argument. And then the second was to, when we filed the motion for partial reconsideration, all of a sudden that 12 years became 15 years. I think this just shows you the codification into law of random interpretations and abuses. The second is this idea of continuous publication or republication. Essentially, I could go to jail for up to 6 years because someone in Rappler changed one letter in one word. They fixed a misspelling of the word evasion, and they changed an S to a T to an S. I mean, it's so quite Kafkaesque for me. I feel like Joseph K in the trial, so that's the one where I was convicted. But I guess let me show you how this connects to our information ecosystem. And I'll just go briefly. You went into what happened from 2016 to 2020. I'm going to show you how a narrative seeded on social media in 2016, 4 years ago, can become a reality today. And that's this narrative of journalist equals criminal. It's the same narrative that was thrown at ABS-CBN, but it is the narrative that allows the law to be weaponized. So in 2016, after we challenged impunity on two fronts, the propaganda war and the drug war, I came under attack, an average of 90 hate messages per hour. Karen gets something similar. You learn to deal with this, right? But 90 hate messages per hour. So what happened then? The narrative that was seeded on Facebook, and think about it like this: 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. Facebook is our internet. In the United States, you're talking about roughly 69% of Americans on Facebook. Imagine if the US had 100%, right? If Facebook is your internet, because you have to look at what happened to us. This dystopia is yours. It's happening there already. I see it, and it starts here. For us, the narrative was journalist equals criminal. In 2016, I laughed about it because I was like, oh my gosh, by next year I'll have been a journalist for 35 years. I'm old, and I figured, my track record actually shows what I've done. My niece is coming in. Jelly, not here. No. Anyway, the second thing is, no. Okay, go. Go outside. Anyway, so journalist equals criminal in 2016. In 2017, it came top down. So in 2016, bottom up, exponential astroturfing. It creates a bandwagon effect that makes people believe it. So even if it wasn't true, saying it repeatedly, and this is something on Facebook, a lie told a million times, especially if it's laced with anger and hate, spreads faster and further than facts. That's crucial. So bottom up, journalist equals criminal. Top down, in 2017, President Duterte in his State of the Nation address said the same thing. A week later, we got our first subpoena in 2018. I had 11 cases filed against me and Rappler. I was part of every single one. And then 2019, 8 arrest warrants. I posted bail 8 times. And I think we've now paid more in bail and bonds. We've paid roughly $80,000 just for me to be free. And, of course, it doesn't matter because coronavirus right now. But anyway, so that's 2018, 2019, arrest warrants, 2020, conviction. Journalist equals criminal in 2016, journalist equals criminal in 2020. This is how you create alternate realities. And the problem with that, of course, is that this leads to the second point of social media. With social media, right now, Facebook YouTube, Twitter, to varying degrees. Every social media platform you're on is now a behavior modification system. And we are basically Pavlov's dogs. And let me explain that one. Uh, it, Essentially, everything you put into these platforms, it turns into data. That data is processed by machine learning and artificial intelligence, pulls it up, and then it takes your weakest moment. These algorithms, the artificial intelligence knows you better than you know yourself. And it takes predictive algorithms that will then take your most vulnerable moment to a message. It's called micro targeting, and sell that to the highest bidder, whether it be a country or a company. This is not advertising in the way that we know this in the past. This is behavior modification. It sets up a feedback loop, right? And how you react is taken in, and the end goal, and this is where you go to state-sponsored influence operations, the end goal is to change the way you think and the way you act. Now, think about it like this. If facts are debatable, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without any of these three, facts, truth, and trust, how can you have democracy? So that's exactly what we've seen starting in 2017, democracy being rolled back all around the world. Tons of studies done on this now. We've documented the data in the Philippines. And now I'll end with just this. The social media platforms, which have now taken over as the gatekeepers to the public sphere. News organizations in the past, journalists had both we created the journalism and we distributed it. And we were held accountable, liable when lies enter that public sphere. If you publish it, you are accountable, right? Well, in today's day and age, that power has now gone to the tech platforms, and they've essentially taken the money but abdicated responsibility. And that now is something that requires global attention. And I'll just show you one decision made by tech platforms that has led to the splintering of our societies and how our public can be turned against journalists. This is the idea that, and this is something that they did A/B testing on. The tech guys just basically said, I'm going to grow social media platforms because growth, optimization for growth is it, right? And they use one concept. They will recommend friends of friends. And this concept grows out of a paper from a long time ago by Mark Granovetter, where he talks about the strength of weak ties. All right, so what does this mean? Let me put it in the context of the Philippines, and I could do this in context of the United States as well. But think about it this way. In 2016, we were all in the center, roughly in the center, because we shared facts. The facts were not debatable in 2016, right? And then after the election of President Duterte, we actively saw the weaponization of social media. So what happened? As the state-sponsored lies started coming into the information ecosystem onto Facebook or YouTube, you can see then our society splintering apart. It happens like this. If you're pro-Duterte, this hand, if you're pro-Duterte, the recommendation engine of Facebook will recommend friends of friends. So you will move further here because you're growing friends of friends, right? If you're anti-Duterte, you will move further here because you're taking friends of friends. It's the growth of filter bubbles. And as your social media followers grow, you will move further here. So the growth of the platform is based on the growth of your own community, and you will move further here. After 4 years, the reason why facts are debatable is because we now have different sets of facts, because the pro-Duterte folks are actually not being challenged by the anti-Duterte folks, right? The journalists are trying to do their jobs, but we are the targets of attacks. And the end goal is to break down trust. And I'll end with this. All of this stems from Russian disinformation, which the Mueller report in the United States already said, and there's a new 1,000-page report that just came out last month. It said it actually showed Americans were actively targeted in 2016. That hasn't stopped. It's still ongoing. And the end goal of influence operations is not to make you believe one thing. It's to make you doubt everything. That's the goal. Because if you doubt everything, civil society cannot act. Akbayan can't move in the same direction if you have different sets of facts. We're doing our best, we journalists, to hold the line, but it's extremely hard. And that's part of the reason you guys are in California. You've got to demand accountability from the tech so that we can demand accountability from our governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We do have a set of action proposals at the end of the forum, and one of them has to deal with some U.S. laws and stuff that can be done. What you said really requires a lot of digesting because they're very, very bitter, very worrisome. It's a very worrisome scene that you painted for us. Let's turn to Karen Davila, and she will talk about the experiences of her own network. Karen, good morning. Thank you for obliging us. I will be the moderator if I can help myself from being a fan of or starstruck by both of you. So please go ahead.
Well, first of all, good morning to you. Good morning, Maria. It's so nice to see Maria. I just want everyone to know I'm in Sorsogon. So I visited over the weekend. So you have to forgive me if the signal will be choppy in a bit. But coming from what Maria said, I think Maria's encapsulated the whole thesis, if this were a paper, of the end goal. But perhaps on a more personal point of view, I can talk about what does it mean to Philippine broadcasts that ABS-CBN is shut down. We often hear Malacanang say and supporters of the administration essentially say that this is not an issue of press freedom because there are other choices where Filipinos can get their news. That's often been said. So the issue of press freedom was an argument that early on they had already brought out. Even in the hearings, the focus was the issue of the alleged violations of ABS-CBN, centering on PDRs, tax avoidance issues, alleged abuse during election coverage that was tackled. We were expecting that to be tackled much further. But the argument is about ABS-CBN had violations, so the franchise was justly revoked. That's the argument and the storyline. When the bigger issue is essentially the protection and holding a free press to a much higher importance and value in the 21st century of a democratic society. So that's one phrase I even got from former Chief Justice Panganiban, wherein you need to hold the free press to a higher value amongst, let's say, treating other businesses. And why is that? Why is that? Number one, did ABS-CBN deserve the death penalty? No less than some senators, Senator Ralph Recto, some senators had said, if lawmakers believe that the owners had done something against the law, then file a case against the owner, but protect the institution. ABS-CBN did not deserve the death penalty. That's number one. Number two, the issue of freedom of the press. Why is that an issue in the closure of ABS-CBN? One cannot argue that ABS-CBN, with more than 11,000 workers, supporting a supply chain of businesses around the network itself and all over the world. If you are an artist in the show, you probably employ 10 other people, or you support 10 or 20 other people. So you're talking of that supply chain of technically the economy, really. So the number two aspect is, why is this a factor when it comes to choice? ABS-CBN is the largest network in the Philippines. And earlier on, even when it was not profitable, ABS-CBN already invested in local stations all over the Philippines. Just recently, ABS-CBN Regional closed over 21 stations, Rene, and I think 12 or 14 local newscasts of TV Patrol. Why is this a factor? If you live in a far province, you know the Philippines is Metro Manila centric. ABS-CBN gave the locals a voice, number one, to expose corrupt officials within their province. ABS-CBN showed the importance that local news matters in the Philippine setting. Because of ABS-CBN, news coming from the farthest parts of Mindanao, even in small areas, this alone in Bicol, ABS-CBN Bicol is very big. It covers the region. Imagine that there are two airports here, and ABS-CBN, which is based in Legazpi. You know, Maria was our news head before. So you depend on local correspondence, the local infrastructure to bring out what's important in that region. Now, Rene, that is all dead and gone. So my thing is this, when they say, yes, GMA7 reaches this area, yes, there are other radio stations that reach this area, I do agree. But then there's also the holistic approach of ABS-CBN of putting these local stories on the national front of TV Patrol, the main newscast. In effect, ABS-CBN modeled the US newscast, wherein the networks would have the nationwide, and then states would have the local newscasts. And yet, if it was big enough, the US, you'd have affiliates locally, but ABS, more than affiliates, built their own regional stations. So that's the laws. Nobody has ever thought of the laws in terms of the coming elections, Rene. Who and what institution can watch over 7,000 islands if you are based in Manila? That's another thing. So imagine what has been lost for the citizens of the far-flung areas in the country. That's two. Number three, the closure of ABS-CBN, whether people admit it or not, sends a chilling effect. You know, the likes of Rappler don't need a franchise. They don't use government airwaves. So you have Maria then facing cases, specifically her person. But what happens now that government has shown we can take it back and give reasons that may sound legal, sound justifiable, but in the end goal is, look, You're shut down. We can do it. That's the message. And my take is, in a democratic space, you need to protect that freedom of choice, freedom of expression, freedom to publish, freedom to broadcast. You need to protect the voice that goes against your own, right? The purpose of media is to watch over the governed. It is not to protect the governor. We hold power into account. Now, does media make mistakes? Absolutely, Rene. Can media be biased? Absolutely, Rene. We are all human. Christian Amanpour said it. I don't strive to be neutral. I strive to be truthful. Journalists aren't robots. People have biases, but because of the ethics code of journalists, before you become one, you follow a certain code that allows you, one, to check yourself, the process of bringing out the news to check itself, and what happens now when there is no news. What happened to the Post? Do you remember when Catherine Graham said, you know, we can't fight, it's easy to fight for freedom of the press if we have a paper to begin with. That was a fair argument on her part. But the editor said, these are the moments that push comes to shove. You need to make a choice. And my choice is, people often label journalists. If you ask the hard questions, Rene, if you criticize a move by government, today you are called anti-government. It simplifies too much the job of a journalist. That is not our job, to be anti a person, anti an administration. But what do journalists do? Journalists call leaders into account. And when you do, it hurts. It's not meant to feel good. It's not, we are not transcribers. We are not stenographers. They expect that journalists, it's almost like you type what's been said. That is not the job of a journalist. I want to tell the audience, journalists put things into context. We go back into history. We compare decisions of other presidents and what it cost the country. That's the difference of experienced journalists, right?
Right.
We are not typists. That's not us. They forget that context matters. For example, something without naming, or because this is not personal to me. If a leader declares martial law on an area, it is the job of a journalist to ask the hard questions. What does this mean? Where will this go? Is it necessary? That's the job. But what happens now is, this is where Maria is right. The whole, the environment discourages you, or wants to discourage you from even doing your job. A recent example, I interviewed Mayor Isko Moreno on the Manila Bay Dolomite sand infusion, so to speak. Now, the Manila Mayor, Isko, one could say he's a friend. I've known him for so long. I've seen his career. He's always had access to the show, but he's quite popular. He's maybe a front runner for the presidency in 2022. I was just so shocked, Rene, to find out today that that interview is hitting 2 million views on Facebook, YouTube, and it's the same story of I want to say it in English, but in Tagalog, binara ako, nasupalpal. It's the same storyline. So it's a personal attack on me, my qualifications, my capabilities, and it sells the one storyline that you shouldn't even be asking these questions this way.
Mhm.
But that's the job. That's what hard talk does. That's the job of a journalist. We need to ask those questions. People think that we do this and wow, it's personal to us. It never is. It's a job to us as well. We get off the show and we do other things. I have children, I have a family, I do the grocery. We don't think much what happens right after that. It's the job that you are called to do. So Maria encapsulated it to what happens now. What happens to civil society when, number one, 90+% of Filipinos have access to Facebook and YouTube in the Philippines. They cannot tell what is, for example, fake views, even fake views, not just fake news, even views. They're not aware that that can't be 2 million views. It's not possible. Physically, scientifically, it's just not. That's one. Number two, why is that important? Because it helps form their opinion and they end up thinking, you know what? If so many people on Facebook say this, that must be right. People lose what they call integrity of thought. You're not able to think for yourself, or you think, wow, I used to think this was wrong, but everyone is saying it's right, then I may be wrong. So you're no longer confident to stand up and really use your own voice. Number two, clickbait. The use of clickbait alone. ABS-CBN did a study before, a survey, that many don't even bother to really read the full article or read or watch the whole interview. Whatever is sold as a clickbait headline, they believe that to be true. If you ask me, that has to be policed somehow. I don't know how. Because then you no longer, I mean, you've lost essentially certain guidelines that you've given to journalists as gatekeepers, because journalists believe, papers believe, TV networks believe, at the very least, we are responsible for what we show. We have level of accountability. But now, who's accountable to what, Rene? You don't know anymore. So I'd like to end there so that at least we can engage and questions can be asked.
Thank you very much, Karen. Before we go into the larger issue of the power of social media, which both you and Maria introduced, let's drill down into some of your experiences to reflect some of the questions that the readers have sent us. For example, Duterte administration had tried to shut down Rappler before. And aside from the cases that you're now facing, do you foresee any renewed attempts to shut down Rappler as the administration shut down ABS-CBN? And I have some similar question for Karen.
Yeah, sure. So number one is, look, the pandemic has had an incredibly.
Oh God, my signal.
So the pandemic has had an incredibly bad effect on democracy and on press freedom. Obviously, the biggest one is that ABS-CBN was shut down. That's insane. Can we put that in context? The last time this happened was in 1972 when Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law, and ABS-CBN was dark for 14 years, right? Are we beginning another decade of fascism? So anyway, so the quick answer to that is the government can do anything. I mean, I asked my lawyers, what else can happen? And they just said, well, anything, you can be charged with child abuse, and I don't have a child. You know, I mean, and I'm not the only one. The Inquirer's owners were
Pressured.
pressured in the same way. ABS-CBN. I think the other broadcasters and news organizations look at us,
Mhm.
and they are not. They don't want to be in the same boat that we're in. But I started by saying what the lockdown accomplished, because we are still in the 26th week, right? We're in the 26th week of lockdown, the longest in the world, and very, very security military driven. Uh, the anti-terror law, while it took months to get to deny ABS-CBN's franchise, and note it is a working group in the House to actually shut down the top broadcaster in the Philippines. That on its own is as insane as the idea of going to jail for 6 years for a story that was published 8 years ago that you had nothing to do with, right? So, but anyway, just that alone, think about how crazy that is, that a little working group in the House of Representatives can actually take away a franchise of the top broadcaster.
Mhm.
I think the second thing is they passed within 5 days
Mhm.
the anti-terror bill, which is now a law. This law was signed. It essentially means that a small group of cabinet secretaries can now designate anyone critical, anyone who decides to speak, a terrorist. And we're seeing this beginning to happen on Facebook. PNP pages, government pages on Facebook are calling journalists, ABS-CBN, Rappler, me. I was red tagged, right? And beyond us, we're the older, high-profile ones, but there are campus journalists who are being red tagged by government pages. This should not be happening. But I digress. So this anti-terror law will allow a small group of cabinet secretaries to designate anyone a terrorist, in which case you can be arrested without a warrant and jailed for up to 24 days.
Okay.
There are 30, almost 30, I believe as of yesterday, 34 petitions at the Supreme Court demanding the Supreme Court throw this law out for just being blatantly unconstitutional. I've signed one of those petitions.
Thank you, Maria. Karen, is this the end for the network, or I guess some of our viewers want to know: is your network pursuing other legal or legislative avenues for regaining its franchise, or does it require the changing of the composition of the House before you get a fighting chance to regain the franchise? Uh, what is the network doing? Is it essentially waiting for a change in Congress, or what are legal uh, uh, paths are you trying to pursue? I think we lost her.
Yes.
Okay, all right. We'll get back to Karen. Um, could you? She mentioned something about, and you did, Maria, about the changing climate. Um, have you noticed and have you observed any signs or any noticeable effects of these government actions on both other media owners, and among your peers in journalism?
Yeah, absolutely. Look at the way, let's take what Karen said, right? If you notice, it placed ABS-CBN on a defensive seat
Mhm.
immediately,
Mhm.
right? That the narrative is ABS-CBN did something wrong, and that is why they don't have a franchise. I
Mhm.
mean, frankly, that's just not true,
Mhm.
right? Like there are laws. If it did have labor issues, or if the PDRs, which by the way we share, right, as does GMA7, as does other blue chip companies, Philippine depository receipts are like American depository receipts in that sense. They were recognized, and in fact, ABS-CBN's PDRs were approved by the SEC. Right, they had to because they're a publicly listed company.
Mhm.
Having said that, look at the way the public discourse focused on these meaningless details that could justify. And that's exactly the way I felt about the decision against us. It's in the real world, they shouldn't work.
Mhm.
But we have now eroded. There's a documentary film where I used, this is democracy, death by 1,000 cuts.
Yes.
Slowly, you are losing your rights and you don't even realize it. Karen is back. You should ask her
Oh,
that.
good, good.
Karen,
Okay.
I would just, are you there? Oh, she's still frozen. But anyway,
Okay.
so I was saying that look at what she said, that it's that she was responding to attacks, that this isn't a violation of press freedom. It is. It
Mhm.
is a violation of press freedom. And the fact that we even have to debate that
Mhm.
shows you how far it has regressed. But America knows this.
Mhm.
We are seeing things happening in the United States that is shocking.
Mhm.
Police losing discipline, right? These are things that would not have been possible, the disintegration of the public sphere, if technology hadn't enabled this. And it has a knockdown, a domino falling. It has an effect on society and on democracy.
Mhm. Have you before we don't have Karen yet, but before she comes back in, uh, as a result of these government actions and the influence of social media, have you noticed any decline, let's say, in Rappler's audience support? Or what's
Um,
the impact on that?
so not on rap. In fact, what it did, that Nietzsche quote, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger."
Okay.
Despite the attacks of government, our community has become stronger. In fact, is helping pay our legal fees, which are exponential as well, right? But I realized I didn't answer your last question, which is, what does this do to other media?
Mhm.
Look, the reality is, and I'll pull it up again, right? This is an administration that uses violence and fear. And I asked this of President Duterte in December of 2016, the last interview he gave with me, because I asked him, now that you are president, do you need to use fear to govern? And he said, absolutely. This is his leadership style. And it does two things. It makes people afraid,
Mhm.
journalists afraid. That is a Damocles sword hanging over every journalist's head. It makes the owners of the businesses of journalism afraid.
Mhm.
And so that's the first. I think the second is the law. The BIR has been weaponized and has gone after news groups, and the
Mhm.
Inquirer included, ABS-CBN. We still have, again, they're one of our tax evasion cases. It's funny, 6 months before the government attacked us with these tax cases, we were given an award for being a top corporate taxpayer, but who cares about context, right?
Mhm.
Now, these tax evasion charges all stem from one set of facts, and they essentially, the way they could file this is by saying that Rappler is a dealer in securities, in quote. That's a quote. They turned us into a stock brokerage house. What does this environment of violence and fear do? I would say the last 4 years has been characterized. You do one of three things. The government corrupt. I call it the 3 Cs: corrupt, coerce, co-opt.
Mhm.
You're either corrupted, coerced into following, or
Or-
co-opt. Corrupt, coerce, co-opt.
Right.
Co-opt, right? And I think that's where I can't actually fault the
Mhm.
business owners of news organizations in the Philippines. Karen said that, at the Washington Post, you have to still be alive to do that. But, this is the death by 1,000 cuts. Because why is press freedom important?
Mhm.
It is the foundation of every single freedom
Mhm.
guaranteed in the Constitution. If you don't have information,
Mhm.
you cannot hold government to account.
Mhm.
And what we have is a government that is extremely good at shaping the narrative
Mhm.
with the help of Facebook.
Mhm. Do you identify anybody in the government who's in charge of that orchestration, or is just a complete, a spontaneous mindset that's ruining everybody's
No,
mentality?
it's definitely it's state sponsored for sure, because you've seen the three waves, right? Why don't I just talk about, there have been three takedowns done by Facebook. Uh, uh, one October 2018, and the one in January 2019, another in March 2019. Facebook did something it hasn't done in any other country around the world. It actually named a private individual and took down all his networks. He was the guy who handled Duterte's social media campaign. He was also the former president of Omnicom Media in the Philippines, which is huge, and the former head of sales and research of ABS-CBN, Nick
Oh,
Gabonat.
yes, Nick Gabonada, yes.
So this is rare for Facebook to name and then to take down the networks of accounts. Part of this is a very gray area.
Mhm.
This disinformation that is fueled by the digital economy is both economic and political.
Mhm.
And the problem is that if Facebook continues to allow this, we really won't have much of a democracy to protect.
Mark Zuckerberg insists on saying that it's freedom of expression, whether it's lies or not. And so those takedowns are unique. But how can it? One of the questions from our viewers is what can we do against this behemoth of uh, the power of social media, which is centered in Silicon Valley, and how can it help the Philippines, for example, like have more takedowns of suspicious networks or suspicious sources of fake news? Which reminds me, do you have any, as Rappler, do you have any kind of clout or influence? You're officially a fact checker for Facebook. What has your access done to influence Facebook to do right by journalism?
So I think three responses to that. You mentioned, Mark, saying it's a freedom of speech issue. It is not.
Mhm.
Sacha Baron Cohen, a comedian, actually had the right quote: freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. The
Mhm.
big problem here is that the lies spread faster and further. By the time you do a fact check, the lie is already a fact.
Mhm.
Right? So look at that. It's even confusing to say lie and fact, right? So
Mhm.
that's the first, is that, this is built into the design of the platforms.
Mhm.
And if the platforms don't do something, it will kill democracy. So the second is, look, the reason we became fact-checking partners of Facebook is precisely because looking at content is a whack-a-mole game. You
Mhm.
won't win in that. And that's an old way of thinking. What you need to do is to look at the networks of distribution. And Facebook has that data. This is data that can be, can be mulled, and people can be penalized for it. The
Mhm.
fact that this is happening with impunity actually shows, frankly, the greed of the social media platforms, because it's already been proven in 2018 that genocide in Myanmar was enabled by Facebook, right? That a UN fact-finding committee went there, headed by the former Indonesian Commission on Human Rights chief, Marzuki Darusman, and they came out with a report: genocide has
Mhm.
happened, and yet there's been no accountability, right? Um, and then I think the third part of the response is we work with Facebook, but you can see from the way I'm speaking, from 2016 to 2018, I thought, give Facebook a chance to
Mhm.
fix what it broke.
Mhm.
But now, from 2018 to 2020, I just realized there's no alternative but regulation. And what's been most effective in getting Facebook to take its responsibility seriously have been its employees, right?
Mhm.
They have been speaking up. I mean, the very fact, Palahipatia, I don't
Mhm.
know if you know his name. He
Yeah.
When he left Facebook, he did another startup. This is a guy who was in charge of their growth,
Mhm.
and he doesn't allow his kids to go on Facebook because he knows how it is, how it shapes your mind,
Mhm.
how it is a behavior modification system. So, look, frenemy, that's what I say, because I still can't fathom a world without Facebook. I don't think Jaron Lanier wrote a book telling you to delete Facebook. I mean, it's not an option for news organizations because, and I think we will see Facebook's impact on news decrease because they're actively trying to push news out. They've created a separate tab, right? And all that means is that the lies will spread faster and further because they're still abdicating responsibility for the public sphere. This is the reality we live in, and I guess we're
So
really
it's
living.
not the lie. It's not the lie and the hate that they're pushing out. It's the news.
Isn't that funny?
That's really something. And so one of our viewers is asking, should we quit Facebook? I think you answered that partly. For news organizations, it's not possible, or it's not necessary, or in fact, it's out of the question for news organizations uh, remaining on Facebook. But individuals,
But even individuals, look, I think it's definitely become so. The other big thing that I demanding from Facebook is that they have much clearer definitions of hate speech.
Mhm.
When journalists are targeted with hate speech, the
Mhm.
attacks against me and Karen, for example, are their gendered disinformation. So it isn't the reason why they are targeting us is because they want us to stop doing our jobs.
Mhm.
It's psychological for sure.
Mhm.
As early as 2016, I offered counseling to Rapplers because we were being pounded on social media, and we have young people. The median age in Rappler is 23 years old. So look, you can't. I think we need to demand accountability, not give up.
Mhm.
So you guys on this, I've seen, the people signing in. You have tremendous power to demand that. I think it's impossible to hold a government to account
Mhm.
until we can clean up the information ecosystem enough to allow journalists to survive.
Mhm.
And the biggest problem there is that the attacks are on two fronts, right? The platforms are being used to tear down our credibility and to intimidate us. At the same time, the advertising, the platforms themselves are sucking the business model, are killing the business model of news, and we're being forced to evolve.
Mhm.
That's a reality. And you know what? We haven't given up. We're
Mhm.
definitely going to keep fighting. And again, like I said, 2019, despite my arrest warrants and was a good year for Rappler. We
Mhm.
were forced to, by April 2018, we had dropped 49% of our revenue, and we were forced to evolve a B2B model based on data and tech. And that grew 12,000%. That's how we survived coronavirus.
Mhm. Mhm.
I
Well,
think that's Karen.
Karen's back.
Karen is back. Yes.
Right, Karen. Yes, I was asking you whether ABS-CBN is pursuing other avenues, legal or legislative, aside from possibly waiting for the Congress's composition to change. Uh, are you pursuing any more efforts to regain your franchise?
Her phone is muted. Can you unmute her?
I'm asking out
There
there.
All right. I think the question of Brene is ABS-CBN pursuing other avenues?
Right.
Well, for context, I mean, I want everyone to know that I am not part of the management of ABS-CBN. So I am not privy, for example, when it comes to future plans or strategies of the network. But I do know that ABS-CBN News is committed to still doing its job. TV Patrol is the main newscast that is still not on air. Well, it is with a Kapamilya online channel. also on Sky Cable, and also I think in Facebook and on YouTube. The Supreme Court has already spoken with that last appeal, and you've said it yourself, Rene. It became moot and academic after Congress essentially revoked the franchise and didn't renew. The only chance, if you ask me, is if ABS-CBN reapplies again.
And okay, but that is there a time period where is there a waiting period before you can reapply?
Well, technically speaking, you can keep on reapplying if, in the strictest sense of the word, but will there be a change? Is it even practical? Technically, you can keep reapplying. So now the government has already taken back the frequencies. But essentially, if you choose to, you can, but will it change?
I see. There's one thing that also still, because I'm not in the business in broadcasting, something that puzzles me is that the franchise is described by the government as a privilege and not a right. Is that a meaning? Yeah, as a privilege, it can be revoked. Does that have to change, do you think, for the sake of
well, I think Maria was speaking about the business model. Even in the U.S., the U.S. broadcast franchises are given by Congress.
Yes.
The thing with broadcast networks is we use government airwaves. There's not a lot of it. So government, in effect, decides who to grant it to. And government is right on that respect. It is a privilege. It is not a right. That is correct. And it goes for other businesses as well. It could go for a bus line. It could go for other franchises granted to other businesses. But the higher value of media in a democratic society is what sets it apart. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should, right?
Right.
There is a cost, a higher cost at stake. And that's when I think what the former Chief Justice had told me is when you need to put a higher value on the value of freedom of the press. Because in the society and even in the 21st century, one can't imagine the U.S. Congress shutting down ABC or shutting down NBC. But it can if we go on legal terms, but should it? Will it? On what grounds can you do it, right?
I guess in the Philippines, it can be done.
Yes, it's been done. Absolutely. We've seen it.
Yes.
It can, and it's been done.
Which strikes me because you were interviewing once one of the key pushers of the revocation in Congress, and you were arguing that the effort to use so-called bias, as a reason, you were arguing that it's a prior restraint. It's not, but the
Absolutely.
but the lawmaker
Thank you.
doesn't seem to understand what prior restraint is and why it should not be applied to journalism. If we have that kinds of lawmakers, then there's very little. I mean, this can be done, indeed.
Yeah. No, I want to thank you, first of all, for watching that interview. And the U.S. is a perfect example in the sense that when you watch Fox News, one can say they're biased. You watch CNN, one can say they're biased. Right?
Right.
Right. You can. In the U.S., it's gotten so advanced to the point that you have the New York Times or papers broadcast networks outrightly endorsing a candidate,
Right.
right?
Right.
Absolutely. Now, that's a whole other level of advancement with a free press. I'm not even going to go there.
Mhm.
But prior restraint essentially would mean, in effect, that committee report, and I'll just go to the facts. Section 9 of that committee report essentially enumerates certain complaints of the House Speaker with the ABS-CBN election coverage. Now, they could have been valid complaints for him. They could have been complaints that he's right, could have been addressed, but that's not the issue anymore. The issue is if you make any form of coverage, content, as part of an issue on the revocation of a franchise, then that becomes prior restraint.
Yes.
Because then you are telling, dictating, without the words dictate, a media outlet on what to say and what not to say and how to say it. So that defines prior restraint already. So that committee report didn't put that much weight on that particular section. Congressman Mike Defensor said he felt the biggest mistake of ABS, according to him, was the PDR issue. But then it turns out that ABS-CBN and GMA7 have exactly the same PDRs for broadcast networks, in which recently it was in the news that GMA had bought back their PDRs coming from the ABS franchise revocation. So the question is, shouldn't ABS-CBN then have been given the same opportunity?
Right. Mhm.
So clearly the issues are not legal in this respect.
Mhm.
It's
It is political. Yes.
one,
Mhm.
yes, it can be denied, but the proof is in the pudding. You see it and you know it. And I think it speaks for itself. It is what it is already.
Mhm. And the president did say, and the president did boast, that the closure of ABS-CBN meant that he was dismantling the oligarchy. Yeah,
In Holosulu.
in Holo- but
Yes.
previous,
And
yes, mhm. Previous to
yes,
that, he denied that he could do anything with it. Previous to when the franchise discussion was taking place, he denied that it was part of his order. So
Oh my
anyway,
gosh. Can we just say lies are part of the public sphere, right? So these are lies. We should be calling them lies. It's very clear based on action. And just jumping off what Karen said, for a legislator not to understand prior restraint is either incompetence or willful ignorance. And the fact that we are reduced to these types of debates, did the president order it or not? Who cares?
Mhm.
The reality is the impact on our democracy, on ABS-CBN, and what that means for the rights that are violated in the Constitution. It's so, what happens when the fox is in charge of the hen house is what it is.
Mhm. So obviously, both of you are still hopeful that things can change for the better. Otherwise, you wouldn't be fighting so hard against these trends of hostility from the state.
mm,
And is there anything our readers, our viewers want to know, and anything you can suggest that can be done by anyone from anywhere to help you fight?
mm-mm. Well,
By the way, at the end of this forum, we do have a list of action proposals that our viewers can consider. Okay, go ahead.
well, I think media persecution is happening all over the world.
Okay.
That's number one. And Maria said this in many of her speeches. This is a global challenge for journalists. This is not just a local problem. I think it is a global problem.
Mhm.
And part of the problem, journalism has gone through dictators worldwide, and Maria's even covered one when she was a correspondent for CNN in Indonesia. So that's not the challenge of a journalist, because that's par for the course.
Mhm.
The bigger challenge already today is, number one, the business model itself is undergoing a major challenge in which legitimate news outfits, if not protected in a certain way, and I'm not asking for protection, that's the wrong word, but legitimate news outfits can die. And if you look at, for example, The Guardian is a brilliant paper, but at the end of it, they are already asking for funds for you to support legitimate journalism. Even Rappler is already asking for support. That would not have happened, Rene, many years back. That would not have happened. And why has that happened? It's also because the model of advertising has shifted. Now with platforms in YouTube, Facebook, advertisers are finding that, oh, this has more views, it has more eyeballs, just put it there.
And
But what
yeah.
will that cost us in the long run? So that's number one. And number two, I feel that you need to fight for this, because this is an existential crisis. The absence of journalism, good, legitimate, hard-hitting, investigative journalism, once gone in a society, frankly speaking, will allow more leaders for abuse, corruption, and will frankly, you'll have the governed everywhere in the world lose the value of their voice, because that's what journalists protect. So for me, that's, I think Maria feels the same way. This is not an attack on a specific person or administration, but this is about the value of what we do. And I think people need to see that importance. Just changing the landscape right now. GMA7, which was my former network, is the only large network left. So virtually, Rene, it's a monopoly, right?
Right.
But why would you want to go back to that, right? What you should encourage is not a monopoly, not even a duopoly, but you should encourage 3-4 networks, like more Rapplers, more newspapers. That's what we should encourage in a democratic space. You don't go back to the time where you just have one network left and you say there's still freedom of speech because you can get your news there. That's not where we should be going.
Thank you. Maria, maybe last words. You indicated that when it comes to the polarizing power of social media,
Yes.
us against them, it seems like it's out of the genie is out of the bottle. We can't put it really back in, right? What?
No, we can't, but we could certainly demand better, right?
Okay.
The business
All right.
model of
Yes.
tech platforms is not the only business model. And in fact, if you look at it, there are major tech giants, but really only two are using techniques of behavior modification.
Right.
That's Facebook and to a degree Google. So All right. So what I think this is one of those times, and I saw some of the questions briefly. This is a global problem. This is not just a problem in the Philippines, and we cannot solve our problem in the Philippines
Mhm.
until the social media platforms give us a fighting chance. We are
Okay.
fighting impunity on two fronts here. It's not just the Duterte administration. And gosh, we've talked a lot about freedom of the press, but why do we come under attack? Because we started reporting the drug war. The numbers of the drug war, like the numbers of coronavirus, are again changing,
Mhm.
right? We just did a story 2 days ago that showed you that PCOO, which runs Real Numbers PH, have rolled back the number killed to like 5,000 something, which is extremely different from the PNP's numbers, which is 2,000 more than that, which frankly is about 3x less than what human rights groups say. Human rights groups, including the UN. The UN places the dead at 8,800. Human rights groups place it at 27,000 at least. The fact that we do not know shows you the problem. That's
Mhm.
how cheap lives are and how easy it is to lie. The
Mhm.
same techniques are being thrown out for the details of our coronavirus. How many people are dying? We don't know. How many people have it? We don't really know. Um, Sorry, you're getting me hyper here. I guess this is it, right? It is a global problem. You
Mhm.
guys there, you had better vote in the United
Right.
States because everything flows downhill. I can't say that, what flows downhill. The global south, we in the Philippines did not have a voice in how Silicon Valley created how facts are distributed, and yet we bear the brunt of it. Um, all told, the 8 criminal cases I face could put me the maximum penalty in each one is almost 100 years. You
Mhm.
know, so the question is, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? Because
Mhm.
that's what we're fighting for. And actually, that crystallized in my head after Time Magazine did that Guardians of Truth, the persons of the year. I found out about that on Twitter.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
actually sent it to our social media team to fact check it because I wasn't sure. But then when I got the call from CNN asking me to go live, I knew. And I thought it was a bad thing at that point. I wasn't sure whether it was good or bad to be named a Time Person of the Year because that could also mean more attacks, which it did. But it's also the only defense a journalist has. When power is trying to intimidate you to silence, you swipe it away and you keep doing your job.
Mhm.
That's the only thing we can do.
Karen, any last words? I think we lost her again, right?
Yeah.
Uh, well, we would like to thank you, Maria Reza, and Karen Davila of ABS-CBN. We would like to thank you both for giving us this opportunity to pick your brains. And it was a very informative webinar. Uh, and thank you for taking the time uh, to be with us. And hopefully, at some other time, we can invite you back again on another issue, hopefully at better times. Meanwhile, we have a set of action suggestions that our viewers can do. Number one, you can donate to Rappler. Rappler is battling at 8 cases in court. Uh, it is crowdfunding for its defense. Uh, we will email all the participants tonight the link to that crowdfunding drive and instructions on how to participate. Second, ABS-CBN has a People's Initiative petition uh, for the regranting of the franchise to ABS-CBN. For registered Philippine voters abroad, uh, you can participate in this petition drive in support of ABS-CBN. Again, you will be emailed the instructions and the link to how to do this. You can also sign a petition calling on the Philippine Supreme Court to nullify the Anti-Terrorism Act. There is a link in change.org for this petition. Akbayan North America has already gathered 2,500 signatures, and it's trying to get 5,000 signatures. You will get an email for the link to this petition. Please sign it. You should register as overseas absentee voters for the 2022 Philippine election. This is for dual citizens or still citizens of the Philippines. The deadline will be for registration is September 30th, 2021. Please do that. Again, there's a link to the registration site. Lastly, the people in the United States should vote early, register to vote, check your status as a registered voter, and vote early. This is going to be a crucial election. With the power of social media, fake news, deep fakes, lies, active participation of the Russian government, the outcome of this election is really up in the air, I think. Many people do think so. And it's very crucial that you participate in these elections for the presidency. Again, thank you very much for being with us, and see you again at another webinar from Akbayan North America. Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much.